Arthur Henderson found the farm on the outskirts of Millbrook County, Missouri, sprawling land with a weathered barn, listed at exactly $100. At 62, he knew such prices meant something dark lurked beneath. The real estate agent, Sophia, had been reluctant to show him the property. "People don't want to buy here," she'd said plainly. "Too much history, bad history." Arthur didn't care about history. His wife, Eva, had passed 18 months ago, and staying in their suburban home had become suffocating. He needed distance. He needed work. He needed purpose that didn't involve the relentless echo of Eva's laugh, already fading from memory. When his boots touched Missouri soil, Arthur knew he'd made the right decision. The property felt honest. When he asked Sophia why it was so cheap, she hesitated. The local legend was that the property was haunted. Strange sounds, equipment malfunctions, workers refusing to return. One couple had sold after 4 months. Arthur smiled. He'd spent 40 years in corporate accounting, understanding how people invented narratives to explain discomfort. The property was inexpensive because it was isolated and required significant restoration. The price reflected reality, not folklore. He'd signed the papers that afternoon. The following Saturday, Arthur arrived with tools and supplies. He'd arranged for Chester, his Morgan horse, to be delivered from the stables. Chester had been Eva's horse, a gift 43 years prior. Eva had loved him intensely, sitting in his stall during her final illness, hand on his neck. Arthur had kept Chester mostly out of obligation, a connection to Eva he couldn't sever. But over the past year and a half, the horse had become his primary companion, his reason to wake with intention. Chester sensed Arthur's grief before Arthur acknowledged it. That first evening, Arthur secured Chester in the paddock and walked the property. He was halfway through his inspection when Chester began acting strangely. The horse stood at the eastern boundary, rigid, refusing to move. Chester's ears were pinned backward. The horse kept circling and kicking at the ground in deliberate patterns near an old oak tree. "Easy, boy," Arthur called. But Chester wouldn't settle. For nearly 20 minutes, the horse pawed at the same area, a section slightly lower than surrounding terrain, dotted with stones and dead leaves. The grass struggled to survive there. Chester fixated on it with surprising intensity. Arthur finally led him away with oats. He didn't think much of it that night. Horses were sensitive. They picked up on things humans missed. But the next morning, Chester went directly to the same spot, and the morning after that. By day 4, it had become routine. Chester would trot with unwavering direction to the area beneath the oak tree, pawing at the ground in nearly the same pattern. On the 5th day, Arthur decided to investigate. The shovel struck something solid on Arthur's 3rd dig. The soil here was distinctly different, darker, more compact. It had the texture of earth that had been disturbed and replaced, then left undisturbed for a very long time. His accountant's mind registered the significance immediately. This ground had a secret. Within the hour, Arthur uncovered wooden framing, partially rotted and dark from age and soil contamination. As he carefully worked away the surrounding earth, the wood resolved into a shape he recognized with growing dread, a box, a grave-sized box. Arthur sat beside the hole, breathing carefully. His heart performed irregular rhythms. He was 62 and had seen enough of life to understand what he'd likely discovered. The rational choice was obvious: call the authorities. But Arthur found himself hesitating. He needed to understand what lay beneath his property before involving anyone else. He continued digging with precision. It took another hour to fully expose the wooden structure. The box had essentially returned to soil, only fragments remained. But within it, Arthur could see the shape of something that had once been human, bones mostly, white and brittle from decades underground, remnants of fabric and leather that had partially preserved in the anaerobic conditions. Arthur found himself cataloguing details with detached precision. an old watch, buttons, a zipper, all of it pale and dead and ancient. He forced himself to look at the skull. The teeth were still present, some intact, others missing. There was a visible fracture on the right side of the cranium, a substantial break suggesting significant trauma. Arthur sat back on his heels. This person had been murdered. There was no other reasonable interpretation. Whoever lay in this ground had died from blunt force trauma and had been deliberately buried here, most likely by whoever had committed the violence. He covered the hole with plywood and spent the remainder of the day in suspended disbelief. He didn't eat. He didn't process. He simply existed in the space between knowledge and action. That evening Arthur called Sophia. "I found something under the ground. I think it's human remains." There was a long pause. Then, "Jesus, where exactly?" "Eastern boundary, near an oak tree." Another pause, longer. Then Sophia said, "I need to make some calls. Don't touch anything else, I'm serious." She called back 20 minutes later. The county sheriff, James Woolcott, would arrive at 8 the following morning. She told him not to speak to anyone else about this. She told him something else, her voice very quiet. "Arthur, I think I know what you found. Or at least, I have a very bad feeling that I do." "What do you mean?" "I'll let the sheriff explain, but prepare yourself. This property has history that goes back much further than I told you." Sheriff James Woolcott arrived at 7:45 a.m. with 2 deputies and a forensic photographer. He was a man in his early 60s with the weathered face of someone carrying 40 years of other people's traumas. He examined Arthur's uncovered hole with a steady, revealing nothing gaze. "How long has this been exposed?" Woolcott asked. "I covered it yesterday evening," Arthur replied. "My horse kept coming to this spot. I was curious." Woolcott nodded slowly. "You did the right thing calling us." He turned to his deputies. "Standard protocol, full excavation, preserve everything." As the forensic team began their work, Woolcott asked Arthur to walk through exactly what had happened. Arthur explained the purchase, Chester's behavior, his decision to investigate. Woolcott listened without interrupting, then said, "You want to know what we're looking at?" "I suspect someone was murdered," Arthur said carefully. "Close enough." Woolcott gestured back toward the excavation site. 31 years ago, a girl disappeared from this county. Her name was Hannah Garrett. She was 17. Her father was George Garrett. He was the owner of this property at the time. He's been institutionalized for the past 2 decades. Arthur felt the pieces align in his mind. George Garrett, one of the names Sophia had mentioned as a past owner. "What happened to her?" Arthur asked. "That's the official mystery," Woolcott said. "Hannah disappeared in March of 1993. She told her parents she was going to study at a friend's house. She never arrived. Search parties combed this county for months. Every lead went nowhere. Then the searches stopped, the case went cold, and Hannah Garrett became one of 30,000 missing persons that year." "But you think her remains are here?" "I think it's very likely. The timeline matches, the location matches. Hannah worked part-time at a convenience store near here, and there were always rumors about George. Questions about his relationship with his daughter that made people uncomfortable." Woolcott met Arthur's eyes. "Some cases, you carry them for decades. You can feel when they're about to break open." By midday, the forensic team had carefully exhumed the entire burial site. They'd found fragments of a 1992 denim jacket. They'd found teeth. They'd found bone structure consistent with a female in her late teens. They'd found evidence of significant cranial trauma. They'd found a class ring from Millbrook County High School engraved with HG and the year 1993. Within 48 hours, the local story escalated to regional headlines. "Remains found in Missouri may solve 31-year-old missing persons case." By the following week, News vans had stationed themselves outside the sheriff's department. Within days, county officials were speaking publicly about reopening the case. Dental records eventually confirmed the identity: Hannah Marie Garrett, missing since March 1993. The investigation that followed was methodical and comprehensive. The forensic evidence was unambiguous. The remains were those of a female between 17 and 19 years old, with cause of death being blunt force trauma to the cranium. Dental records confirmed the identity as Hannah Marie Garrett, missing since March 1993. But the larger mystery was more complex. George Garrett, now 78 and living in a state psychiatric facility in Kansas, was initially considered the primary person of interest. However, psychiatric evaluations suggested that Garrett's current mental state, characterized by advanced dementia and severe dissociative episodes, made him unable to reliably communicate about events from 3 decades prior. Then Arthur received a phone call from Amelia Chen, an investigative journalist for the Missouri State Journal. She'd been researching the case and had discovered something significant: medical records that had been sealed in 1993. "Can we meet?" she asked. "I think you need to know the full story." They met at a coffee shop in Millbrook. Amelia was in her late 40s, with the focused intensity of someone who had spent decades pursuing truth through layers of institutional obstruction. "Hannah Garrett wasn't just missing," Amelia explained, spreading documents across the table. "She was pregnant. She had visited a clinic 2 months before her disappearance, confirmed she was carrying a child, approximately 4 months along. The clinic records were sealed as part of a non-disclosure agreement signed by her parents." Arthur absorbed this slowly. Why was this sealed? Because there was significant evidence that the father of the child was Hannah's biological father, George Garrett, Amelia continued quietly. The pregnancy resulted from abuse that had been occurring for at least 2 years prior to her death. There were medical records indicating prior trauma, psychological evaluations suggesting coercion and familial abuse, and testimony from Hannah's mother, named Eva Garrett, indicating that she had discovered the relationship and attempted to intervene. Arthur's stomach tightened. What happened? According to Eva's sealed statement, she had planned to take Hannah and leave George. She was going to file charges and ensure that Hannah received psychological care. She had arranged with a private adoption agency to place the infant after birth, but before any of that could be formalized, Hannah disappeared. And George killed her? Possibly. Or his rage at losing control of the situation, combined with Hannah's attempt to escape, resulted in a violent confrontation he couldn't recover from. Amelia pulled out a final photograph, a news clipping from 1993, showing a family photo. Hannah was young, blonde, smiling. George was stern and imposing. But it was Eva's face that arrested Arthur. Eva Garrett looked exhausted. She looked traumatized. She looked like a woman carrying an impossible burden. "Eva never recovered," Amelia said quietly. "She spent 40 years in that house, unable to speak about it due to sealed records. She developed severe depression. She rarely left the property. She died in 1998, officially recorded as a heart attack, but there were suggestions of complications from prescription medication misuse. The official record was that she was grieving her missing daughter. The reality was that she was a woman destroyed by institutional failure, medical confidentiality laws, and the knowledge that the justice system had been designed to protect her abuser." "Why are you telling me this?" Arthur asked. "Because I'm writing the story," Amelia said, "and because you deserve to know that finding Hannah's remains wasn't random. Your horse didn't accidentally find that spot. The property itself has been processing this trauma for 31 years. When you showed up with genuine intention to build something new, something shifted. That ground had been waiting to release its secret." The formal investigation concluded that George Garrett had deliberately murdered his daughter Hannah in a violent confrontation in March 1993. He had then buried her remains beneath the oak tree on his property, a location where the body would remain undisturbed. Psychiatric evaluations determined that Garrett's current mental state precluded prosecution, but the case was officially closed, with George Garrett named as the perpetrator. Garrett died in his psychiatric facility 6 months after the remains were discovered. He never faced trial, he never formally confessed. He simply existed in his dissociative state, carrying secrets that decayed alongside his cognitive function, until death rendered all questions moot. But the investigation had exposed the broader institutional failure that allowed such a crime to persist in shadow for 3 decades. The sealed medical records, the confidentiality agreements that had silenced Eva Garrett, the assumption that family privacy should supersede child protection. The authorities found themselves confronted with questions about systems that routinely prioritize the privacy of abusers over the safety of victims. Amelia's article, published in 7 different publications and winning a regional journalism award, had catalyzed state legislative changes regarding sealed records in cases of family violence. It had created awareness about the specific forms of coercion and control that made victims reluctant to seek help. It had given Hannah Garrett a voice that extended beyond her grave. For Arthur, the experience had been transformative. He had purchased the property seeking isolation and escape. What he had found instead was connection to history, to trauma, to the larger human experience of carrying impossible truths. Chester had guided him not by magic, but simply by responding to something in the soil itself, something archaeological and essential that called to be witnessed and understood. In the months following the discovery, Arthur restored the property not as a place of new beginning, but as a memorial for Hannah. He worked with local historians and Eva's sister Sophia to establish a historical marker near the oak tree, Hannah Garrett's name, the years of her life, a sentence about bearing witness to truth. Every morning, Arthur would walk to that marker with Chester, and the horse would stand quiet and still, no longer digging, no longer agitated, simply present. Arthur would think about Eva Garrett, a woman who had lived in silence for 40 years, carrying the knowledge of her daughter's fate and her husband's crime, trapped by systems designed to protect abusers. He thought about Hannah, who had tried to escape and had died in the attempt. He thought about how trauma echoes through generations and through soil, waiting for someone to finally listen. One evening, as Arthur sat on the porch of the restored farmhouse, watching Chester graze in the pasture that had once hidden a grave, he received a call from George Garrett's younger brother, John. John had never believed the official narrative. He had always suspected his brother was capable of darkness. Learning his suspicions were hideously confirmed had broken something in him, but it had also freed him from a lifetime of uncertainty. "I wanted you to know," John said, his voice thick with emotion, "that you did good work, finding her, bringing her home. Whatever you believe about how it happened, whatever you think about the horse or fate or coincidence, you brought closure to people who had been living in a kind of death themselves." Arthur thanked him, but after hanging up, he realized what John said wasn't quite accurate. There was no real closure. Some truths could only be integrated, not resolved. The weight of what had happened on this land would remain, but now at least it could be witnessed. Now at least Hannah Garrett could be remembered not as a missing person, a file number, a case that failed, but as a young woman who had tried to survive, whose life had been stolen, whose grave would be honored. Chester had known. The horse had carried in his body the sensitivity humans had trained themselves not to feel. He had responded to the Earth's disturbance not through any supernatural mechanism, but through the entirely natural sensitivity of a creature attuned to the world's subtle alterations. As Arthur stood and prepared to go inside, Chester approached the fence. The horse pressed his muzzle against the post, his eyes meeting Arthur's with clarity that transcended species. In that moment, Arthur understood what Eva Garrett might have felt in this horse's presence, comfort in a world that had become impossible to navigate. Not magic, not anything mystical, simply genuine presence, simply bearing witness, simply refusing to look away. That was enough.